So we would kind of want to start off with a little bit of a economic update, although we don't want to make it the full bore slide you to death economic update. We wanted to make it very relevant to the topics we're covering today and the client base of both Aldridge and Dormy. So we focus this on really the middle market and what's going on in M&A. And I thought a little background here would help kind of cover why some of the things we're going to talk about today are pretty important. So if we look at this is really just middle market M&A activity. And so the purple bar, right, is the deal count, and the orange line is the deal value. And what you can do with this is kind of extrapolate what the average deal sizes were. So when we look kind of in those pre-COVID years, 18, 19, a lot of the deals in 20 really did happen before the world shut down or were in process then. Really our average deal size around that time was like 21, 22 million. And you can see the number of deals were all kind of right in the same range. And then what happened in 2020 was it was looking to be this really strong M&A year. Things were going great. We had a lot of deals in the pipeline too. We were getting ready to take to market. And then everything paused for several months. Everyone went, oh no, we don't know what's going to happen, buyers and sellers. And so that led to a lot of pent-up demand and very high valuations in 2021. Everyone was ready to do all kinds of stuff. And all those deals that were on hold in 2020 got done in 21 and 22. Average deal size in 21 was 28 million. So huge jump from what you saw in those prior 3 years. And then some of that carried over into 22. It was back down to like 23 million. But then interest rates started going up in late 22, and that kind of created another kind of pause and led to a little more risk. And I kind of called 2023 the year of the lower risk tuck-in deal. So what happened was a lot of companies, instead of buying something that was maybe more of a stretch business, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in here, they'd buy something that kind of really just fit in their model that they could absorb within their company. And this was both private equity or more professional type buyers and strategic buyers. And average deal size that year was about 15 million. So it was a lot of smaller deals. And you can see the count was still pretty high when you got into like 23, but the deal value went down pretty significantly, when you look at it at a macro level. And all the deals we worked on in 23 were all, accretive to a business. They were kind of the same business and went into that. So, and then 24 was kind of a hybrid year. A lot of deals still happened, but average deal size started to trend back up about 17.5 million. You do the math. And then early 25, and we only have Q1 data because we're not even quite done with June yet. And that data comes out quarterly. Lower number of deals, but usually Q1's a slower quarter. However, some of the economic uncertainty that started late 24, early 25 with like tariffs and some of those other impacts, the count was down and some of those other economic considerations. But what we're seeing is companies can still sell in this market and get a good price. Average deal size in those Q1 deals was just under 19 million, but there's a lot more diligence and buyers are taking less risk. So they really want to know that it's a good, good market for that. And we're seeing that in the companies we're working on right now. We had a client that was under LOI, diligence 90% done, but it was the most extensive diligence process we've ever gone through on a pretty well-run business and pretty short up. So, so there's just a lot of things in that space. And we're seeing that across all the transactions we're working on right now. It's a much more thorough diligence process. And the reason why all of this happens is because M&A activity is highly correlated to lending. And when we look, this is a slide we always like to look at. We have prepared this for a long time. It's always part of our economic updates. But if you look at this, the blue bar again is M&A activity, so deal count. And then the orange bar is a survey that talks about the survey of CFOs saying are the lending standards tightening, which means it's going down, the orange bar, or loosening, which means it's going up. So if you kind of look at historical trends, right, like during COVID, right, early COVID, it was tightening. Then, as things we're coming out of it. It was loosening pretty significantly. We've gone through a period of when rates started going up in 22, tightening, some loosening. It's kind of flatlined here, but maybe tightening a little bit. Anytime it's kind of over that horizontal bar, that's usually a tighter credit market, and does tend to slow down M&A activity a little bit. And you can kind of see it in those deal count stats. And what that does is it puts a little more pressure on valuations, and tends to slow down the M&A activity. And so we kind of see that in our numbers. But the reason why this all matters is because of this. Most transactions, all private equity transactions, and most smart strategic buyers will fund their deals with both equity and debt. And by equity, we just mean cash that they have on hand and debt. And, private equity firms go out and raise capital from institutional buyers, family offices, a lot of different things. Family offices may have a tranche of equity as well. Strategic buyers keep cash on their balance sheet to do acquisitions, but they also get debt to do acquisitions because that increases their return on investment on those acquisitions. And if you think about it, if I put less of my own cash in the deal, that's my investment. And so the better the acquisition does, the less cash of my own I put in, that's my investment number on it. So they look at it, and so they use leverage to be able to do more acquisitions with less raw cash. And so that's part of why that lending activity matters so much in the M&A markets, and why that interest rate means that when that rate goes up, it means that they have to be more careful about how much debt they're putting on a business. When the rates are really low, you can make some mistakes and it'll be okay. Rates are higher, a mistake is a bigger deal. If the business doesn't perform as planned, that's a bigger problem. And so that's kind of where all this extra diligence comes in, both from a risk, financial, all those areas. So kind of big picture, that's why some of this stuff matters. And, a disciplined strategic buyer looks at this the exact same way as a private equity buyer, but, and usually the equity portion might only be 30 to 50% of what they're putting into a deal. So they have more cash available to do additional acquisitions, even within that business. So if we talk about, so this means that buyers have to be a little more strategic in their focus, which, Chad, I think this is where we wanted to have you jump in.
Yeah, I'm happy to talk through this, and that some of the organizations that we've helped from a buyer perspective, they're approaching this usually with a plan, or at least they know how they want to structure the ideal deal and know which ones they're going to be open to. And they're usually considering one of three broad strategies within this. The portfolio buyer is somebody who's looking to bring in a complementary business or bring it under a larger holdco that may not necessarily ever be intended to fully integrate with their other lines of business or their other investments. It could be something where it's a different business, but it's complementary, or it could be something that they're bringing on as an investment itself, where there's some future intention to be able to improve it and then sell it and gain additional value. Most of the buyers that we've got direct experience with are usually going for an integration or something similar, but I wanted to call out that portfolio is certainly a valid buyer strategy on it. Most buyers, when they start thinking about buying, they're looking for either a tuck-in or a hybrid, or as Jennifer, I think you called it, accretive, where you're going for a consolidation. You're going for an economy of scale on it. The tuck-in and the hybrid approaches really are just a matter of scale between the two. Tuck-ins are generally a smaller percentage of total revenue of the buyer, so there's not as much risk to the buyer on it. And it's much more about buying the customers, the working group, the team, the knowledge base, the working capital, the process and the flow of what the seller is bringing to the table that is offering the value to the buyer. The hybrid, the accretive, the consolidated solution is really where you're trying to build the best of both worlds. You're both looking to gain an economy of scale and be better together going forward on this. And yes, it's going to be under the buyer's name, but frequently there's a lot of the secret sauce or the identity of the seller that persists through the transaction. Again, this is all about just managing the outcomes and making sure that both the buyer and the seller are going into it with eyes open and they're comfortable with what the outcomes are going to be. As buyers, you've got different profiles, or for each one of these profiles, you've got different levels of integration that you've got to be prepared for. And we'll talk about what integration looks like later on. The level of integration effort is frequently underestimated or unaccounted for at the start. That's a big part of diligence, is thinking through what's the plan going to be when we do integrate them. How quickly can we do this? How soon are we going to be able to realize the revenue out of the investment for it? And then there's, of course, the proportionate complexity to that, which leads ultimately to the risk to value. How much effort as a buyer are you going to have to make to be able to realize the value of what you're acquiring from the seller? Jennifer, I timed that really well, and I think we can, unless you've got something else you want to add there, we can head on to the next one.
I think we're good. And part of this is to kind of explain like how this process kind of works and what you go through. So what we've laid out here is kind of the full process of if someone actually proactively goes to market. This process can be circumvented if someone gets approached by a buyer, but if you take the time to actually prepare ahead of time, there are some big advantages to going through a full process, because you tend to get the best price in the market at that point in time. And it's important to know what the full process looks like, just to understand how you can maximize value in advance. So I think we're both aligned in that it's very important to maximize your value well before you're going to go to market. So generally, I say at least 2 years ahead is a good timeline. 3 to 5 is even better, but sometimes we don't know that far ahead. So, just thinking ahead of time, there's a lot of things you can do to really drive value. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But then once you say, okay, now we're ready to go, there's a preparation phase where you're really I call it kind of packaging the business the right way, thinking of the right strategy of how you're going to go to market, putting the right materials together. And you do some of that earlier on too, but this is really kind of the, tightening up the story. Initiation is where you're proactively approaching buyers. Selection is then when have a focus list of buyers. And then execution is where you've picked the one buyer you're going to be exclusive with and going through the diligence process and getting to a close. And then post-closing, you're working through integration and how do we come together as one company now, not 2 separate companies, and really drive value that way. So, once we said, okay, we're ready to go to market, that process from, starting to closing takes about 6 to 9 months. Everyone thinks, I'm sure you've heard this too, Chad, we get approached all the time of like, and we'll someone will talk to us in like July and say, can I close by the end of the year? I'm like, maybe, but it's going to be tight.
You're changing the risk equation at that point.
Very much so. Very much so. So, and we'll kind of run through these quickly. This is more foundational knowledge. We've done whole seminars on the process, but that's not today. But when we talk about maximizing value before you go to market, this is very important stuff, and the things that every company can do ahead of time.
If I could share on those from the buyer perspective, helping clients navigate this when the clients are the buyers on this, some of the things they're looking for in the operations and financials, they're looking for a healthy mix of revenue within the seller. They want to be relatively confident that revenue is going to be sustainable after the transaction, that there's not some really secret sauce inside the seller that can't survive a transaction like this. They're looking for cases where there's like a disproportionate amount of revenue that's coming from a small set of customers. Generally indicates that there's a strong relationship element to it. How's that relationship maintained? The questions are, what's motivating the customers to stay? What's the relationship value that they're receiving on this? Because ideally, you're trying to maintain a going concern. The seller wants to make sure that their customers, their employees, are frequently going to be well taken care of through this process. Granted, this is usually an equity-based deal, or it's an exit strategy or something for the sellers, but there are also sellers that want to stay on afterwards, and they're especially interested in being comfortable that the buyer is going to recognize here's why the seller values their business and the buyer respects that and how they're going to carry it forward. I'll also call out that third point under long term. We're introducing the idea of technical debt as a term here. If you think about it in physical terms, if you're buying a manufacturer, if you're a manufacturer, aging equipment on the manufacturing line is a risk. A buyer would value a manufacturing business that has aged out equipment that is constantly needing service lower than somebody who has a modern production line that can continue to operate like an engine. If you're in business, aging IT is a similar risk. I mean, we're seeing organizations that might be ill prepared for modern cybersecurity threats, which means that whole business is at risk for an unplanned interruption, that the buyer weighs that. Or you could have systems that require constant care and feeding or manual workarounds that aren't immediately visible, but as a seller, you want to be looking for those types of weaknesses in the engine, things where you recognize this is taking a lot of extra effort to keep the wheels on it. A buyer is going to find that same thing. A diligent buyer will find the same thing. Those are the types of things that you can shore up in maximizing your value.
Right. And, one thing I always like to talk to clients about on the financial side, right? We've had clients that, clean financials are kind of just the baseline that you should have. And I always kind of talk to clients, there's 3 ways you can handle it for an M&A transaction. One, you can do nothing until you're ready to sell. And it impacts price more than our clients ever even understand or know. Because what happens is if you do nothing beforehand, it impacts the buyer's confidence in that information from the get-go. And it will impact your price more than you ever know. I mean, I can't tell you how many times we've had a client that had someone approach them. They say, I need 3 years of financials, and our client just sends them. And you have already created, without creating add backs or adjustments for anything they do discretionary in the business, but once they've sent them, they've already created a mindset in the buyer's mind of the value of that business. And for us to unwind that once we get involved is a challenge now, because they already have a number in their head that now we have to try to unravel. And we can't unravel it as well because we didn't get the chance to create that first impression. So we've already created an inherent discount. So doing nothing impacts the numbers right out of the gate. We can do something right before selling, so we get a chance to frame that story better, right? And that's cost effective because we get to do kind of all of that reframing right at once. But in that example, like we had a client that we were getting ready to take to market. We did a whole exercise where we kind of restated their project costs, got stuff in the right period, made their numbers look better, which was great. But we figured out they missed some billings even to customers. So they could have had better earnings numbers. They also could have had better cash flow. They could have used that number to manage their business better, that information to manage their business better. They never got the chance to do that. So they had the right numbers to go to market, but they never got that tool to manage their business well. Or they could do it right along the way. And then they had the right numbers to manage their business. So they had better outcomes along the way. And they had the right numbers to go to market with. So, you can do it any of the 3 ways, but one of them seems to have a better risk tolerance in it. And so, there's a lot of things embedded in the financial side, but there's that's kind of the big one that I see. And then, short term, there's a lot of things that are great things to do in a business that are not great things to do if you're 6 months before you're ready to sell. Like implementing a new ERP might be one. Or, managing through, like managing risk one I thought was good was like, I've seen a lot of things where, there might be a big HR issue right before someone's ready to close it. It's like, that is the one you have to manage more effectively than anything you've ever done before. Maybe get an attorney involved where it might have been something you wouldn't have before, but just making sure you button those things up more than you probably might have in another situation. And so if we kind of get into maybe some of the risks before you go to market, which that kind of led into, I think, a little bit, I'm sure we both probably have some stories here.
Yeah. I think the moral of it, yes, managing risk, keeping the wheels on, making sure the engine is sustainable. The engine is a value proposition to the buyer. But one of the key questions that we expect sellers to be thinking about, we expect buyers to be thinking about on this is when the seller is starting to incur or is choosing to incur particular expenses, who's going to realize the benefit of the expense? If you're the seller, are you actually operating the business engine? Are you building performance? Are you building sustainability? Or is this a future investment where you're spending money today, but you're not going to realize any future value, but you're potentially locking the seller or the buyer into a strategy, or it's a sunk cost that maybe the buyer doesn't value the same way that you do? I mean, I've got, fun stories on that. I know we've got another slide on going to market on that, but I've seen buyers get some heartburn when sellers, and this is not denigrating or anything, but I've seen people buy toys just prior to a sale completion, or they're investing in future R&D. The seller is like, great, this is the direction of the business, and the seller is still in the mindset, I'm still going to be driving this, and therefore I've got to be investing in R&D and what's important to me. The buyer's got their own strategy for R&D that is going to occur post-transaction. It's important that you're working together on that through the process. Don't be investing in things that have a 3 to 5 year horizon. If you're trying to set the strategic direction of the business, you have to be willing to let some of that go as the seller and work with the buyer. And same way as a seller, just before your transactions are not the time to scale up your teams or to start releasing new offers or incurring new debt or long-term liabilities. Those all now, to the buyer's mind, you've just complicated the risk landscape quite a bit for the transaction. If it's cooperative, great. And long-term agreements need to be aligned to the strategy that the buyer's valuing.
Yeah, we had a company, we actually, Dora May, who does some acquisitions too, we looked at acquiring, and they had just signed a long-term lease. We were like, but you're looking to sell like that? Yeah. It was a nice little added wrinkle in the, like, yeah, just kind of simple things like that where you just go, huh.
Just candidly, Aldridge, as an MSP, we frequently are engaged 3-5 year terms with organizations, and we're working with sellers. But what's important in that is also being able to recognize what's the buyer's value going to be for that, having that agreement. And for the right vendor that's along the way, they're bringing expertise that's keeping the engine operating, but they're also experiencing being able to manage that transition and then adapt to a new service portfolio that is appropriate and aligned to the buyer. But it means that the buyer doesn't have to scramble on day one or month one or even year one in order to be able to keep the value of the engine running, and they've got a partner to be able to work with. The same way that other vendors that sellers might be engaged with that are critical to the way the business operates, there can be value to agreements that persist beyond the duration of the transaction, especially if it's giving the buyer a bit of a runway.
Makes perfect sense. And thinking of those timelines well in advance, kind of drives that go-to-market timing and strategy as well. So, but yeah, I could probably spend hours on this slide of weird horror stories of risk that
choices in the moment.
That turned strange, but one of my favorites is that, and I've had this happen a few times where we had clients with just inventory challenges, right? Like they, and this was typical closely on business stuff, but you don't have a great system for your inventory, so you count it once a year. And so you counted at closing, and the counts were much higher than they'd ever been because closed sale businesses tend to be very conservative on that number to drive down taxes. And the buyer then gets surprised. However, you also give the buyer multiple options to come out and count with the client, and they chose not to do it till closing. So in all those cases, it came out favorable for our client, but it could also come out not so favorable depending on how managed. But
I have to imagine those favorable outcomes are when they're aligned to what the business value engine is already doing. Like they've got committed orders, or this is all aligned to their forecast and their revenue streams. This is not something where they're not taking a bet or making a long shot with it. They're demonstrating diligence and proper operation of the value of what they're selling.
Yeah, it was good inventory, not garbage sitting there that shouldn't have been there. Yep. So when a business is going to market, right, this was kind of a little more breakdown of the actual steps. So like I said, preparation is when you put the materials together to highlight kind of the key strengths of the business, right? And, we list a few here, but to highlight consistency of earnings, consistency of margins, strength of the leadership team. You're looking at what type of deal are you trying to do? Is the owner staying? Are they going? Are we what are we looking at? And the more options you have there, the kind of the easier businesses to sell, for lack of a better way of putting it. If it's a situation where I want to sell 100% all cash, walk away, you're going to have less options in the market. If it's a, hey, I don't mind staying for a period of time, you're going to have more options. I don't mind rolling over some of my interest, you're going to have more options. Doesn't mean you might wind up doing a 100% deal, but you might have more options available to you if you're more flexible. So, and we talk to clients about that all the time. Looking at what's your positioning strategy and your story, who are you going to go talk to? We always have clients that say, like, there is always one buyer that they will say, I will never talk to that buyer. That's fine. A lot of businesses have a competitor they don't like, and sometimes that's the best buyer and sometimes that's the worst buyer. So that's fine. And then we put together what we call a confidential information memorandum. And a lot of times we have clients that really want to like wordsmith that and really get involved in that. And it is a story of your business, but it's a story of your business that's designed to give a buyer enough information to put an offer together. So it's a different story than a marketing story. We use some of your marketing materials to create it, but it is unique, and it's a little bit different. So, and then, we talk about who should be involved in that in the organization, who shouldn't. You do want to keep that group as small as possible. You don't want to create organizational angst about this for people who maybe shouldn't be involved in it. And so it's an important part, kind of putting the right team together on it too. And then so that part involves a lot of our clients' time to get the information right. Then initiation kind of hands it off to the team to take it to market. So, and the point of the initiation running at the same time is you want to start talking to everyone together. You don't want one buyer to be ahead of everyone else in the process. It kind of removes some of that competitive tension and kind of messes up the timeline of the deal, really. But what you're trying to do is get the materials out confidentially to everyone. You have them sign NDAs, things like that before you give them the confidential information memorandum. But and then you give them some Q&A things, and they'll give you what's called an indication of interest, very broad terms of an offer. And you kind of decide, and kind of their thought process, their rationale for why they might be interested. You look at those initial proposals and decide who's going to move forward. So that's kind of these first two phases. Out of that phase, then we, say, okay, out of the 10 indications we got, and I'm just picking numbers, it really varies a lot by business, industry, level of specifics. You'd say, okay, we liked 5 of them. We're going to bring them in to meet with management. We're going to give them a little deeper access to a little more detailed numbers, bring them in to see the operations, talk, have one-on-one meetings, and then have them put together a more detailed offer, which is an LOI. The reason why I kind of like to walk through this is pre-signing a letter of intent is when you have the most leverage. And you should never sign a letter of intent until you have almost all the key areas of an offer you want in that letter of intent. So, and the thing that tricks up more sellers than anything else is the fact a letter of intent says it's non-binding. It is non-binding with everything except exclusivity and a few other provisions. But once you sign this, your leverage goes from high to low, because now you're kind of in the machine and you're exclusive with that buyer. So if there's something you want, it's important to get it in the letter of intent. And so, and I always say, like, once you're going to market and you're going through a process, time is the enemy, except in step 3. Step 3, time is when you go, it takes what it takes, and I will negotiate till I have what I want. Because especially if you're talking to more than one buyer, because that's when you can kind of not play them against each other a little bit, for lack of a better way of putting it, and get the deal you really want to get. And so you don't sign this until you have a deal you're willing to do.
And I would say, towards making sure it's a deal that you're willing to do, as a seller, you've got to be realistic about what your real motivations are. Are you focused on a valuation fit? Are you focused on a business fit? Are you focused on a culture fit? Are you focused on your ramp up, your ramp in, your ramp out? Are you focused on your team's ramp up, in, or out? Are you focused on your customer's experience? What's most important to you can really drive a lot of your decision making and choosing which buyer you want to engage with. You've got to feel good about it. This is the most factual based sales process that you're going through on both sides, but it's also very emotional going through. And as one of the sellers in going through this, initially I wanted to make sure, great, my team, but most importantly, my clients, my customers, were going to get great service. And I was viewing my first sale as I'm going to scale up, and I have the option of I could spin down and take my knowledge and go someplace else and spin back up. But I'd really like to be able to carry the relationships and the equity along the way, some value out for what I've already built, and bringing the right team and the right people. All the sales process is already done. Let's just start working together. Be realistic about what your motivations are as a seller, because that will drive what you're willing to accept from a buyer.
Yeah. And I always tell our clients, be honest in these meetings, be transparent, ask great questions. Buyers should respect that if they're the right buyer. And, normally if they don't, they're not the right buyer for you, and that's okay, so.
As importantly, be willing to let go of the things that you realize are not as important to you.
Right.
I've seen transactions that we've helped clients navigate, diligence and acquisition integration, where somebody gets hung up over one point that really doesn't matter to them, but they just want to make the point. And be realistic with yourself on both sides.
Yeah, that's a great point too. But then once you go exclusive with someone, you move into, I think, every client's most hated phase, which is due diligence, probably from buyer and seller side, really. But I don't know. But yeah, maybe let's start with buyer perspective, because I think it's probably a better spot to start. Yeah.
So from the buyer's perspective, they're looking at how complementary, and let's assume that it's either a tuck-in or it's going to be consolidation. They're looking to understand how consistent the value engine is going to integrate into what the buyer already has. But it's also critically important to, if you think about it from the buyer's perspective, the business doesn't run without the people that are there and the key roles and how it functions. That's part of the value that the seller is bringing to the table that the buyer is now evaluating. And understand from the buyer's perspective, it's a group hire. I'm hiring anywhere from 50 to 100 to 500 people all at the same time, but it's also a group hire. It's not that I'm hiring 100 individuals at the same time. It's that I'm hiring 100 individuals that are used to working together and working together in a certain way, and understanding how that works and going through, what do the business processes actually do? How do you do quote to cash? What's your revenue flow? How do the sales processes happen? What's going to stop working if it doesn't start, or if it doesn't maintain the same level of attention throughout the process? From a technical perspective, the buyer is looking to see, do you have leadership within your technology, or is it just kind of happening to you? Do you have leadership within cybersecurity? Do you have leadership in your architecture? Do you have leadership in your operations? And those things go beyond IT as well. Those are the types of things where you're looking for the resiliency of the engine. And I've been in circumstances where we've missed one or two of those things and didn't realize, or we made an assumption going in. I've been in conversations where, hey, we assumed that system was going to be functioning because it was represented extremely well by the seller or something. But then you start peeling it back and you realize, oh, wait, that's working extremely well because it's got a Band-Aid and some Scotch tape over this one part. That suddenly becomes a high priority item later on when you get to integration. That's what diligence is trying to uncover, is where those potential weak points are, so that, again, we're just working to manage risk. Jennifer, I'm sure you can speak from the seller's perspective.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And I always kind of have a standard thing I kind of talk to clients about right after we sign LOI, we get the diligence list. And this process will drive you nuts. Everything you've learned about the business over the 20 years you've had it, or 10 years, or, whatever your timeline has been, they're trying to learn in, 30, 60, 90 days. So they are going to ask you the same questions over and over. They're going to be redundant. They're going to overlap. They're going to seem stupid. And you just need to answer them and get over it. Because part of that is just they're trying to uncover, is it consistent? Is it the same? Is it, are they getting the same answers? But, and they're trying to do it quickly. And they have a bunch of different service providers, and they should be talking, but they're not. And so that is what it is. And we'll do our best to help manage that, but sometimes it will happen, and it's going to happen a lot.
It can be very difficult if somebody calls your baby ugly at that point, something that you are emotionally invested in.
Right, right. And the other thing is don't make up new stuff to answer questions. Say you don't have it because you haven't tested what you've made up. It may not be right. And then you're going to create a bunch of uncertainty. Like, and, some of the silly examples I'll use is like, we'll have clients create like a sales by customer. Well, if you don't have a report that has that and it doesn't match your revenue, now you've created a whole bunch of doubt on like, well, is it right? Is it not right? Is it wrong? And that's something we will check before we give it to someone. But that's like a really simple, silly example. But if it's a report you haven't been using to run your business and you're going to create something to answer a question, just don't do it. Don't give it to them. Don't create it. Say, we use this instead, or we don't have anything like that because we don't manage our business that way. What they ask for and what they've used to run their maybe similar business may not be something you needed because you ran your business differently, and that's fine. And the other thing is don't feel stupid because you don't have it. You had different parameters and different motivations and different reasons. That's fine. That may be an integration issue they have down the road that they're going to look at post-closing, but that's not something you needed at the state you were in at the time you ran the business. And that doesn't mean you did something wrong. It just means it's different. And we have a lot of clients that feel like that process means they did something wrong. I'm like, no, you just had different goals and objectives. And that's what it is. Don't automatically go on the defensive when the answer is no, or I don't have it. It just means you didn't think of it that way. And that's all okay. And so but that's always kind of part of it. And I think, our point there about don't create doubt by over explaining or scrambling. We run into a lot of that. And that tends to make the process go on longer because it gets that over explanation part pretty heavily.
Jennifer, when you're helping a seller approach that type of conversation, how do you help them practice for that? Or how do you help prep them mentally for that type of conversation?
Yeah, sometimes we'll get a list ahead of time and if we can tell it's something they're going to struggle with, hey, let's run through this before we get in a meeting or call. We've had some where we've just straight up gotten ahead of an issue. So like, a lot of times the back and forth will be managed through like a data room or things like that. And we've had situations where something's going to go in a data room. A bunch of advisors are going to look at it. They're going to get all spun up. And so we'll go straight to like the CEO of the buyer and just say, hey, this is going to get uploaded. Here's what happened. Here's the situation. Sometimes one of them, I remember distinctly, we had this conversation of, you're going to be glad this happened on their watch and not your watch. So don't let everyone get wound up about it. And one guy in the organization is sensitive about it. So don't talk about it in front of him either. And he's like, good to know, and like, and it never came up again. Like
managing the messaging, being ahead of it and being open about it.
Yeah.
Yep.
And, once we told him, he basically shut it down with all the advisors. And now you can't do that on every single thing or it wouldn't be effective. But when it's something that, okay, this could be like the biggest thing ever, or we could just manage it up front and make it go away, then we do it. But if a client doesn't tell you that stuff ahead of time and it just winds up in a data room, then it can go sideways real fast.
Suddenly everybody thinks there's a smoking gun sitting in the data room. Yeah.
And, frankly, it's, the advisors who handle diligence for the buyer's job to find the smoking gun. So they're going to look for it and turn it into that, even whether it is or isn't. So you just got to stay ahead of it. Yeah. And if we kind of think a little more about due diligence, really kind of thinking, how does it solidify the story, I think is important too. And creating that consistency in the messaging.
Yep. And I think we've touched on maximizing value and managing the risk from both the buyers and the seller's perspective. Yeah. Do the things that make sense, that drive the business forward. Don't take the long shots. This is not the time to take the long shots.
Right.
I feel like we got so enthusiastic with our storytelling that we may have jumped a bit ahead of our slides, but
I think we did a little. Yeah, no, I'm looking at that. I was like, oh man. But I think another important thing on the diligence side, like financial diligence, I always kind of like to highlight this because when we talk about revenue quality, usually financial diligence consists of a quality of earnings report is what they'll call it. And they'll have an advisor come in to do that. everyone thinks that's what that consists of what it's called, right? Quality of earnings. So they think it's like revenue and earnings based, and it's really kind of it's not really what it's called. I mean, they do a proof of cash. So they do prove that like what you deposit in your bank account ties back to your revenue and your cost, and what goes out of your bank account ties back to your cost. But that's like one small piece of it. What they really do is look at your monthly financials for like 2 to 3 years, and they compare variances and trends. So and that's not really what it's called, right? They don't call it a trending analysis, which is really what it is. And that's the bulk of the work that's done. And so one of the things we talk to clients a lot about is do monthly trending on your financials and do consistent things monthly that you would do at year end. And then you're kind of ready for that. But that's not something that it doesn't ever really explain. It's never explained that way. It's kind of part of the mystery of M&A.
And I'll say just on the third point, from a technical perspective, again, the buyer is looking to see who's maintaining the environment. Is the environment operating on a roadmap? Is it just kind of flapping in the wind, or is it appropriate? Is it diligent? Is there a plan for it? What are the expected expenses that are going to be happening in the next 12 to 24 months from a technical perspective within the environment? Who are the key people that know how the key line of business applications or the key business processes work, and what's the plan in order to be able to retain them through the transition?
Yeah, the financial side is really interesting because, everyone thinks that, I have to have an audit to go to market, but an audit's an annual event. And so it doesn't really prepare you as well for the M&A financial diligence as consistent monthly reporting does on that side of the house. But it does prepare you with what needs to be done at year end by pulling that back to monthly. So it's a little different process on that front. And then organizational diligence, that is driven a lot by the buyer. I mean, I have seen situations where the organizational diligence has been insanely robust with multiple streams in that area. And then I have seen where it's just kind of okay, we're going to have our internal team come out and run through some questions because we're in the same industry and we get it, and like.
Which I think speaks to the strategy of the buyer as well. Do they expect that the acquisition is going to be able to operate as an independent entity that's sustainable? Or are they really looking to gain an economy of scale and tie things together logistically?
Yeah. And even the customer side, right? If there's concentrations, they really want to dig into the customer side. If it's heavily varied, it's much less of an issue. So it can be largely driven by that. Yeah. And then kind of the last phase of all this, right, is when we get to closing, where we're kind of documenting the whole deal and getting to all that. So, getting through legal and deal terms where, like disclosure schedules are a whole nother beast where you kind of write down all the things in diligence and schedules that are attached to the agreements that, and then funding. And, I always say, like, our job is to help negotiate the best price and terms. And then a lawyer's job is to make sure you keep it all through disclosures and reps and warranties and all those areas. So that's, a lot of the documentation side that happens at the end is around that. And then a lot of the operational stuff kind of just gets plugged in the gaps there of all of that. And day one tends to get rushed and hectic when everyone's trying to focus on getting it closed at the same time. But
yeah, having navigated through a couple of these, for closing, one of the last steps in closing is that final communication. The deal's signed at that point, and we're right before we're going to start integration. But now we're at the closing phase, and it's getting that messaging to employees in a meaningful and time aggressive way so that you can manage the messaging through it. Because if you think about it, if the employees are finding out about this sometime between closing and when you actually have formal messaging, social media posts start going out, and you've lost control of some of the messaging that is necessary to make sure that the customers feel comfortable, the vendors feel comfortable, the processes, the employees are transitioning. And one of the key things, one of the first steps in integration is the employees now have a new employer. There's going to be group hire changes associated with that. So thinking through that communication as one of the first things that happens as soon as that deal is signed is an important part of leading into a smooth integration.
Mm-hmm. And that's why I always think HR diligence is such an important part, and doing it well where they are thinking through, like, okay, are we making sure benefits match? Are we making sure things make sense. And I've seen situations where that's done extremely well and where it's not done extremely well. And it can create a ton of anxiety there that doesn't need to get created at all. And it's never the intent. It just, or almost never the intent. I won't say never, but almost never. And it can be rough. But yeah, getting those messages aligned is critical.
Which I think steps us into integration.
Right. Yeah. Right there.
So the communication, the financial, getting aligned on the operating state of the business. Jennifer on it better than I can, how important it is, or actually I'll ask this as a question. What do you typically see in the buyer's motivation? How quickly are they trying to go for financial integration to be able to get a handle on how the business is operating?
Yeah. So what I often see, right, is a buyer wants to integrate as fast as they can. A seller often doesn't, right, because it creates operational angst for them. But at the end of the day, the faster you can do it, the better off everyone is, despite everyone thinking they're not better off. And the main reason why is because it creates this disconnect in numbers and information and understanding and how you're working through things that just continues until you get it aligned. The one exception to that in my mind is if it affects the customer experience. Or holds up the customer experience. You know, when a customer gets an answer of, we can't ship you product today because we're doing a system changeover, that's unacceptable. Like that.
And I think this ties in on the integration path. This goes right towards that last step in integration with the cultural integration, where you're now one company operating under the buyer's banner typically, or the buyer's acceptance of the brand of the seller or integration. That cultural integration is really dependent upon all those steps that have happened before it. And a lot of sellers get motivated by, I want to make sure that we've got this transitional process. And they're thinking towards that cultural integration step as that's the thing that would make me emotionally comfortable, is to know that we've hit that cultural integration. Everything you're describing, Jennifer, that has to happen and has to be done expediently but diligently are prerequisites to that cultural integration working well. If you're operating in two separate sets of books on two different platforms with two different delivery processes with redundancies and misaligned HR, for example, the cultural integration becomes a very steep hill to climb. Whereas if those things are thought through in diligence and then managed through closing and then worked through logistically and integration, managed as projects, these are top tier initiatives within the organization that the buying organization has already allocated resources to in their diligence, knowing when we go live with closing, these things have to happen. We have to have the bandwidth, we have to have the resources, we have to have the capital aligned to be able to make these things happen so that we can get to that point where we've actually got one operating business at the end.
Mm-hmm. Like I remember an acquisition we did where we had another office and we were on two separate versions of Teams for 9 months. That's crazy. Like we all knew how to use Teams. Like we all but yet it was communication barriers that didn't need to be there. You know, like that's
usually one of the first things that I see buyers want to get solved is there has to be almost seamless communication between the buyer and the seller, even if they're operating in different systems. They need to feel like even something as simple as, I need to be able to see the other guy's calendar. I'm trying to schedule an appointment with somebody that I'm working with, but I can't see their calendar, much less see if they're online or not. That is extremely disruptive.
Ago, but, but it was not ideal, obviously.
Yep.
And then, you know, our biggest piece of advice, I think, uniformly was, you know, the earlier you start on any of this, the better off you are. And whether you're buying, selling, you know, making sure you have the right structure to be ready to do it is critical. And, you know, kind of across all the things we've talked about today.
Completely agree. Might be the most succinct comment I have for any slide. Yes. Start early, be thinking about what you want to get out of this.